It's a very early December morning and we're sitting at the heart of a part of London called Little Venice. It's called Little Venice because you can see behind me there's water and there are canals, and I'll come back to that. But its real name ought to be Westbourne, because this is the heart of one of those curious little London villages that was called the village of Westbourne. London really is a series of villages that, as the city grew bigger and bigger in the 18th and then the 19th century, joined up, which is why you get these curious place names like Paddington, Marylebone, Westbourne, Notting Hill. They were all little villages that slowly joined up. Now this area is really interesting because when this was first being developed and people were beginning to live in the village of Westbourne, all the land was owned by the church. And it was a quiet, sleepy hamlet for literally nearly 1,000 years, owned, as I say, by the church. It was predominantly, of course, agricultural, and by the 18th century they grew vegetables, they grew other salad things for the tables of the wealthy over in the West End of London. And then something happened, and what happened was this: the canal, the waterway. In the first industrial revolution, the only possible way of transporting goods was not by the awful roads, which in many ways in Britain were still the roads the Romans had left behind. The only way was by water, by canals, and there began an astonishing period of canal building. We're sitting at what was at the end of the Grand Union Canal, and this canal stretched all the way back to the Midlands. That's all the way back to places like Birmingham and Rugby in the heart of the city, and it was there that there was manufacturing beginning in the late 18th century. What you did was you made whatever it was you did, put it on a canal boat, a narrow boat, which was pulled by a horse and brought all the way down to London to here. And this area, and behind me over to the left over there, was the largest inland port in the southeast of England. It literally was like a huge port with hundreds of canal boats coming in, unloading, and then going back. What did they take back? Well, that's really very interesting. They took back horse manure. Remember, the whole city was indeed without motor cars. It was horses that pulled everything, and horses produce a very interesting waste byproduct. This used to be piled up in enormous heaps here that were known as the Paddington Alps. The smell was absolutely disgusting. It was known as stinking Paddington. But of course it was extremely valuable to take back to the agricultural area of the Midlands. Well, in time what happened was that the canal here, which stopped here, was in the wrong place. You wanted a canal that would carry you on to what was becoming, as Britain became an imperial power at the beginning of the 19th century, the River Thames, where the big international port of Britain was situated. And so they dug another canal, and behind me there is that second canal called the Regent's Canal that snakes its way through North London all the way eventually to the River Thames, where it joins up with the port. And for a brief period, I suppose probably about 50, 60, 70 years, this was the great industrial highway of Britain. And it coincided, of course, with the rebuilding of London too, because on those barges coming up the canals were not only things like livestock and produce and other luxury goods, but also bricks made in the Midlands and slate for the roofs from North Wales. So in a way, the new great bustling metropolis that London becomes at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, begins here in the village of Westbourne. In time, of course, the canal was taken over by something you can't see, which was the railway. And by the 1840s, the railway had become the principal means of transport for an industrial economy. And in time, the railways too eventually faded and the roads take over. And you can't see that either, but over to my left is one of the only elevated motorways ever built in London, which was the great route out to the west of England, which goes parallel to the canal and parallel to the railway. The whole of the area around here acquired the name Little Venice. We're not quite sure when. Many famous literary people have lived here. Browning, the poet in the 19th century, lived here, and he and his wife, Elizabeth Barrett, who he rescued from her tyrannical father in Wimpole Street, he and she both loved Venice, and maybe it's said they gave their name to the area. The pool here is called now Browning Pool, but I think it more likely is that Dorothy L. Sayers, a great thriller writer who had a studio around here, who wrote books in the 20s, it was she who gave it its name. Those who live here now are very affluent indeed. When I first came here, it was a kind of bohemia with artists, writers and so on. Now it's a place of extraordinary affluence. Once the whole estate here was owned by the Church of England. Then they sold it on. And one of the nice things about when the Church of England owned it, for those of connoisseurs of perhaps the low life, was that in fact there were enormous numbers of brothels and large numbers of prostitutes working out of the houses in this area.